Good morning, everybody. I'm going to try to start right on time. I'm John Haskell from the Library of Congress. We welcome you to the 18th Annual National Book Festival. It is because of contributors like Wells Fargo, David Rubenstein, and many others that this is now officially the best free event in Washington. I'm going to turn it over to Carlos Lozada and the program in a second. I do want to remind you to turn off silence your electronic gadgets. We're on TV, so it won't be appropriate. I'm going to say one thing about Carlos and then turn it over to him. As probably most of you know, at an event like this, Carlos is the nonfiction book editor at the Washington Post. He was also at one time the economics editor there and national security editor and the Outlook section editor. He was just this year a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize for criticism, and in 2015 was the winner of the National Book Critics Circle Citation for Excellence in Reviewing. Carlos, welcome.
Good morning, and welcome to the National Book Festival. It's my favorite event in Washington, bar none. So we're here to talk about spies and intelligence and maybe hacking, who knows. But it is quite an honor to introduce this morning's panel. Our moderator is Kai Bird, the author of The Good Spy, The Life and Death of Robert Ames. He's also the co-author of the Pulitzer-winning American Prometheus on the life of Robert Oppenheimer, which I must confess is one of the greatest biographies I've ever read. No surprise, Kai is also the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography at the City University of New York. Our panelists are Washington Post columnist and novelist David Ignatius, author of 10 novels, most recently Quantum Spy. Spy novelist Joseph Kanon, author most recently of Defectors. And Adam Sisman, whose latest book is a biography of, and he has explained to me the proper way to pronounce it. It is not le Carré, it's le Carré. We can have a debate about this later. In addition to being part of the panel, they'll be signing books at 1 o'clock. With that, I'm thrilled to hand it over to Kai Bird.
Good morning. So I assume we're all here because we love a good spy story. But we don't really often admire spies, but we love a good spy story. So that's what we're sort of here to discuss. And we have on stage here, excluding myself, really three of the world's foremost experts on the world of intelligence. And I'm really delighted to be here. My name is Kai Bird, and I want to first make a plug for my little biography center at City University. It's called the Leon Levy Center for Biography, funded by Shelby White for the last 11 years. And it's a very special thing. It promotes the art and craft of biography in a very specific way. We hand out 4 $72,000 fellowships, 4 of them every year. And the deadline is in early January, so if there are any budding first-time biographers in the audience, think about this fellowship. I want to begin by talking a little bit about Robert Ames. When I was 13 years old, my next-door neighbor was Robert Ames, a spy. I had no idea he was a spy. And then years later, he was tragically killed in Beirut in 1983, and I read a novel by David Ignatius called Agents of Innocence. And David is not only the Washington Post's reporter on the intelligence beat, but this was his first novel, Agents of Innocence, and he's now written, I think, 10. And that book got me interested in trying to figure out who my next door neighbor was. And David encouraged me to do this book and gave me many sources. And the only reason the Good Spy happened is because of David. I first met Joseph Kanon in Los Alamos. And his first spy novel was called Los Alamos, and he had in it a lovely, just moving portrait of Robert Oppenheimer, whom I later wrote a biography on. And I had to tell Joe that his little portrait of Robert, Oppie as he was called, was the best I'd seen, and better than my 800 pages, which tells you, the power of the novel. Finally, we have, all the way from London, Adam Sisman, who is a biographer's biographer. Literally, he wrote a biography of the biography, i.e. Boswell's presumptuous task. And now, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, he came out with this massive biography of John le Carré, otherwise is really known as David Cornwell. And he rips off the mask from this very enigmatic man that you all know as John le Carré. Anyway, we're going to begin with le Carré, and as some of you may already know, le Carré was himself a spy for about 5.5 years, and many of his novels draw upon that life. But Adam, you explained. While he cooperated with you, he refused to talk about his 5 years as a spy and specifically what he was doing in Germany. And yet you found out a great deal about what he was doing with Germany, but why the reticence even so many years later?
Well, there's his answer and there's my answer. I mean, a bit of background. When he left Oxford, where he had in fact been reporting on his fellow students, including a fellow American student to MI5, but he'd not come in from the cold, as it were. He was a schoolmaster at Eton for a bit, but then he joined MI5, and he worked for MI5 for 2 years before going over to the dark side and joining MI6, where he was posted to Germany. He says that he made a commitment back then not to talk about his secret work, and he wants to keep to it. Le Carré, for a long time, pretended that he wasn't involved in secret work. He used to say, I'm just a simple civil servant, that's all. And he has gradually come out of the closet, as it were. But he's very much in control of that part of his story. But I found out from other sources what he was doing, and essentially, in the British Embassy in Bonn, as it then was, in what was then West Germany, he was, it's what's called undeclared. That means he was posing as an ordinary diplomat, a second secretary, but he was in fact reporting to and working for MI6. And his job really was to it wasn't running agents across the border into East Germany or into the Soviet bloc, but keeping an eye on political developments on both the extreme left and the extreme right in Germany. And one of his lesser-known books, in fact, A Small Town in Germany, which is, I think, unrecognized, I think it is much better than people realize, is very much a portrait of what he was really doing.
Joseph Kanon, turning to you. Joe, you seem, along with John le Carré, to have had an obsession with Kim Philby in your work. And your latest book, one of your characters, Frank Weeks, is clearly modeled after Philby. Explain your obsession.
I think he's one of the most interesting characters, or real-life characters, that anybody has run across. And we had the great good fortune that, A, he wrote memoirs, which are highly questionable and self-serving. But we also had the great good fortune, he had 4 wives, 2 of whom wrote memoirs about his time in Moscow. So if you're an espionage novelist who is not himself a spy, every time I come to DC, by the way, on book tour, there will be a question from the audience about, the craft that's in your books. And it's always a coded, loaded question saying, how long have you been an espionage agent? And I always say to them, I have absolutely no idea really what it's like. I just get it from other books. I have never been approached. I've never been recruited. And someone said, well, of course, you would say that. So it's a total no-win situation. The serious answer to the Philby question, and yes, the character is very much a kind of American Philby, and in large part that's because the number of details about daily life there come from what we know about Philby, because there's more documentation about him. But I think he's an exemplar of why I think we're all interested in spies, which is one of the great questions in all of literature is, who are we? Who is that other person? How knowable can anyone be to us? And when you encounter a spy, it's someone who is deliberately pretending to be someone else. This is a crime if you're an undercover agent. It doesn't have a narrative arc, like an armed robbery or something. You're committing a crime 24/7, all the time, your whole life. You're lying to your colleagues, you're lying often to your spouse. You are living a lie. What could be more interesting to a novelist than to write about someone who, not only are we trying to peel back the layers of that onion to know him, but he's resisting at the same time. I think it's a push-pull that any fiction writer is drawn to, and readers, I hope.
So that reminds me, Le Carré himself once wrote that writers, like a spy, his real work is done alone, and like a spy, writers need secrecy. Isn't there a sort of a similarity between what we all do and the world of spies?
I think you can convince yourself of that. And when I started working with David, I started to imagine myself as an agent and think of assignations and be checking out of the window whether that person across the street wasn't there 5 minutes ago and that sort of thing. It is very seductive. David himself, David Cornwell, that's the real name for John le Carré, he plays a kind of teasing game with, as readers will know. I mean, he wrote an autobiographical novel called A Perfect Spy, which depicts someone whose early life is identical to David's own early life, and whose father is a portrait of his own father. When his first wife, his divorced first wife, read the manuscript of A Perfect Spy, she said, I always wondered whether David was a double agent. And I found myself wondering that too. I don't think he was, actually, but he plays that tease with his readers and carries on doing so.
So David Ignatius, your 10 spy novels, of course, draw upon your own experience as a foreign correspondent. And I've always suspected that the typical foreign correspondent, you were stationed in Beirut at one point, often has better sources than the average CIA officer. Wouldn't you agree that that's true?
I think one technique that I used as a journalist for many years was to think about who the CIA likely would have recruited in a place, and then take a run at those same people on the theory that they'd begun to start talking and they'd, once the cake is cut, what's another slice? I think that in the time that I got started as a journalist, which overseas was 1980, the United States had the wind at its back, and people all over the world were eager to work for the United States, work secretly through the CIA, work openly in other ways, because it was good for them. They'd get business, they'd make friends. That was the way the world was going. I think we're now heading into the wind rather than having it at our back. And maybe it is easier for journalists to approach people. I was going to just say briefly in response to the earlier theme of the way in which being an intelligence officer is like being a journalist. And that's just obviously true on one level. You know, we're trying to pull people's stories from them. We're trying to establish rapport. We're trying to get people to say things that they might not otherwise say. But there's one huge difference that you just have to underline right now, which is that journalists, if they're doing their job, don't lie. You know, we're about telling the truth, and we work for our readers. And, you know, it's obvious that we're in a moment where that role, that understanding that that's what we do, and that we're not in the business of lying is being challenged. So I get a little nervous when I hear people say, well, it's just like being an intelligence officer. It's a little bit like it, but ideally there's that fundamental split that makes it very different.
There's also a dark side to this, the Le Carré statement. Yes, it's like being a spy, but it's also a question of, are you betraying people as you're doing this, as a spy inevitably does? There was a famous journalist who once said that ultimately we're always selling somebody out, which means that you're drawing material for them and using them as copy or the basis for whatever you're writing, without really going to them for this source. You know, one tries to do that as little as possible, but it does happen.
Yeah, I mean, I completely applaud what David said. I mean, that's absolutely right and principled. But novelists, as opposed to journalists, they are making things up. They are, and often they are betraying people in the sense of using people that they know, people close to them, as models, or using the experiences that they've had with people, maybe very intimate experiences, to construct the plots of their novels. So I don't think the distinction is completely clear-cut in that sense. I think that David Cornwell's parallel between spying and writing novels holds in that sense. And there is I mean, Cornwell's novels are full of betrayal, and they're not just spies betraying each other, they're people betraying each other in their personal relationships. And of course, Philby did this himself with his wives, amongst other, and many other people, but he wasn't just betraying people for intelligence reasons, he was betraying people, he was an extraordinarily duplicitous character, wasn't he?
Well, but, you know, as a biographer, I find I'm constantly trying to seduce my sources in the same way sometimes that a spy does, I guess, to cultivate a source. You're trying to, you're not lying, but you're trying to get people to talk. And you had to do this with, I'm sure, with many of Cornwell's friends.
Yes, I tried to do this with David. I often think, oh, I know a way to get through, you know, his defenses. And I'd arrive and start talking to him, and I'd put the killer question. And then I'd realize that he'd anticipated the question and prepared an answer. He is a very, very skillful and very clever man, and I often felt that he was playing me rather than me playing him.
So, in a larger sense, I've always wondered whether spies are a little overrated. You know, and that is actually one of the themes in some sense of Le Carré's novels. They are either failures, or if they actually uncover, you know, valuable, actionable intelligence. And David Ignatius, maybe you can speak to this in your work as a reporter covering the intelligence world. Even when a good spy comes along and offers valuable intelligence, no one in positions of power wants to hear it. It doesn't fit with the conventional wisdom, it's awkward, so in history, I see examples again and again of this happening. So again, I'm wondering, while we all love a good spy story, aren't they a little overrated?
Well, if you mean they overrate the importance of the intelligence that's obtained in the flow of history, I think that's probably right. I think of the story, Kai, that you and I spent so much time thinking about. For me, it began on a morning in February 1983 when I went to the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, and about 12:30 I leave seeing the military attaché, and at about 1:05 this enormous car bomb detonates, kills Robert Ames, one of the great intelligence officers the United States has produced, kills everybody in the CIA station who's in Beirut that day. Kind of searing memory for me is running back and seeing the ruins of the embassy, the dead bodies everywhere. And there was subsequently a CIA officer who was determined to find out how that bomb got there that morning. He just made it a passion at a time when it was very dangerous for Americans even to be in Beirut. But he went person to person, who recruited the Shia Hezbollah officer in the south, who met the one in Beirut, who rented the car, et cetera. And he gathered all this intelligence thinking, people must know, all these people died, all these American heroes died, got to find out. And guess what? He finished that reporting, and so far as I know, nobody ever did a damn thing about it. So, there's an example where, the truth, you shall seek the truth, and the truth doesn't set you free. It's not really all that efficacious. So he's a fascinating character. I wish he was here to join our panel, because he'd be pretty angry about that question.
And you can't reveal his name.
Well, another time.
No, that's a story, that is still a mystery. Who organized and executed this car bomb attack on the first U.S. embassy? And it's a story that I try to dig into in The Good Spy, but it remains a mystery. And as you say, no, the U.S. government really didn't take any action to try to figure it out.
But taking your larger point, I think there is a room for a lot of skepticism about the value of intelligence. I mean, if you think of many of the most important episodes in recent history, from Pearl Harbor through to the attack on the Twin Towers, through to the failure, the concocted story that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, et cetera, again and again, these are intelligence failures. They may be failures of CIA or MI6. I mean, I think we should regard intelligence skeptically. And often the intelligence is there, but it just hasn't been recognized or properly analyzed.
Right.
That's really I think, as far as I understand it, the root of the problem is I think, I mean, the CIA obviously has much greater, and the NSA, much greater resources than any other intelligence agencies. And in a sense, they gather too much intelligence. There's so much that you can't see the wood for the trees. There's just a vast mass of material and not clear what the shape is.
Adam, that reminds me of a story when I was doing my biography of McGeorge and William Bundy, the two Bundy brothers. William Bundy had worked in the CIA for a long time in the 1950s, working under a man named William Langer, who was a Harvard professor who had been recruited to become head of the Office of National Intelligence in 1952. And when he was recruited, he told Allen Dulles, well, I can't possibly do the job if you give me more than 25 analysts. He wanted it small and lean, and he recruited Bill Bundy as one of those 25. But of course, today, we have an intelligence bureaucracy that numbers, David, how many?
Oh my gosh, it's count all the agencies, it's in many, many tens of thousands. It's crazy. We're not getting our money's worth.
I mean, a good example of the failure of British intelligence came in 1940 when British and French intelligence failed to predict where the Germans were going to attack. And they cut through the Allied armies and caused the fall of France, caused the British to withdraw ignominiously, leaving all their equipment behind at Dunkirk. It was a disaster. And afterwards, when the intelligence was analyzed, it was shown that there were indications of where the Germans were going to attack. They should have known. If it had been properly analyzed, they would have. They should have known that, but they just there weren't the mechanisms in place.
And
to
Stalin
do so.
famously was told that Hitler was going to invade.
Yes,
and
yes.
decided to ignore it.
Again and again by us.
Yeah.
So maybe our fascination with spy stories comes from the fact that these stories are metaphors for human failure. We're all human, we all fail, we all make mistakes, and spy stories are a particularly vivid vehicle for showing how this happens.
I think it's fair to say that better spy stories do that, but most spy stories are triumphant. You know, they're about daring do and people who succeed at whatever task they're succeeding. You know, when people say that we're all working in the shadow of le Carré, I think that's true. I think he invented the modern espionage novel as we know it. But one of the great innovations and what makes it a vehicle for exploring character is that essentially he took it away from those lampposts and trench coats and he brought it into the office. I think all of his novels, one way or another, are about office life. This is particularly true of a small town in Germany. And if you notice, there's very little violence. There are very little actual secrets. What the plot usually involves is an intelligence agency discovering each other and who's betraying whom. And in a sense, this is very accurate because he was lucky to be at the apogee of the Cold War, which from a fiction writing point of view was a wonderful source material, a great subject. Because what you had was a war in which the ground troops were the intelligence agencies. You know, combat troops did engage from time to time, but all during the Cold War, it was the intelligence agencies who were really on the front line. And so he had a wonderful subject, all of which we could relate to. Very few of us are ever going to live like James Bond, but all of us have worked in an office where there's an impossible person controlling the files, and a boss who turns up late and never answers you, and all of those things. If you remember in Spy Who Came In from the Cold, what presumably precipitates his disaffection is a quarrel over the pension payment. It's all very bureaucratic.
In Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, there is a scene in which Peter Gwilym steals a file from the circus archive, and he's manufactured a dummy file to put in its place. And it's described to me as one of the most exciting scenes ever set in an archive. And it is, in fact, extraordinarily tense and very dramatic. But it is really just a man going into a room of files, taking one file out and putting another in its place. That's what happens.
The thing I think that makes John le Carré's novels unforgettable, that marks all of us in some sense, marked and limited him later in his career, was the creation of the character George Smiley. George Smiley embodies the sense of the ambiguity, the moral uncertainty, the kind of routine nature of intelligence work at its best. And just getting ready for our discussion, I went back in my library and went back to the very first John le Carré novel, which was published in 1962, called Call for the Dead. And the first chapter is called A Brief History of George Smiley. And it opens with a description of exactly the character that we then lived with in so many novels. This is his very first book, and he already sees Smiley, describes him as breathtakingly ordinary. And in the first paragraph of that book, his wife, Lady Anne, runs off with a Cuban race car driver. You know, Lady Anne in the books is always betraying him with somebody, famously Bill Hayden and Tinker Tailor. But that's, to me, the genius of Le Carré. He lived a lot of real life. He has all this real life espionage to draw on. But he had the brilliance to see this character. He said that it was drawn from a rector of Lincoln College at Oxford and his first boss at MI5. So it's drawn from real people. But there's George Smiley. There's his wife. There's the sense of betrayal. Peter Gwilym is in that first book. The Special Branch Inspector Mandel, if you know these books. They're all there. And then he has that deck of cards from the start, and then he just keeps playing them through his career, right down to Legacy of Spies, the most recent book, which I loved, which has Gwilym and has Mandel, all these same people who were in the first book. Amazing.
I'd like to echo that. I think that the thing about George Smiley is that he is a complete contrast with James Bond. James Bond never questions what he's doing is right. James Bond is an action man. He has no real inner life. Smiley is all the time troubled, anxious that the human damage being caused to all these little people or ordinary individuals is worth the game. The game that he's troubled all the time. And he's even worried about his archenemy Carla, when at the conclusion of Smiley's People, Carla comes across and Peter Gwilym says to him, "George, you won." He's not sure that he did win, and he's sort of hoping that Carla will actually go back because he feels sorry for him. So Smiley is a man with a conscience. He's full of ambiguity. He's not an out-and-out Cold War warrior.
So Adam, that brings us back to your biography, which, as I said earlier, you sort of ripped the mask off this guy. He is an enigma, and you get very close to him. You tell very intimate stories about his love affairs, mistresses, wives, his betrayals of his wives, his troubled childhood, his crazy con man father. It's very revealing. And so I wonder, how did you had his cooperation, how did he react to the book? And why did he publish his own memoir, The Pigeon Tunnel, in 2016? I guess he must have been working on that when you were working on your biography, no?
Well, to answer the first part of your question,
how did he react?
He reacted with a 22-page email with 200 and something numbered points. And as you can imagine, when I received this is when I'd sent him. I had an agreement that he would be the first person to read the manuscript before my editor, before anybody else. And so I sent it to him, and a few days later, this email came thudding into my inbox. And my first reaction was dismay. But when I started to go through it, in fact, the points were generally points of fact, constructive, thoughtful, and we only really locked horns over perhaps a dozen of them. And he gave way on half a dozen, and I gave way on half a dozen. So it wasn't really a problem in that sense. On the other hand, I won't pretend that he's entirely happy about my book, and he seems to have got more grumpy about it as time has gone past. But I feel if he had been entirely happy with it, then perhaps it wouldn't have been, I wouldn't have done my job properly. I had to not be too friendly. And he recognized that too, I think. I mean, he's a very thoughtful man about biography as well as everything else. His editor at Knopf, long-term editor, Bob Gottlieb, who's dealt with a great many fine authors and very clever people, said to me that David is the cleverest man I ever met, bar none. And I would put him up there too.
So did your work inspire his memoir?
No, well, It's described as a memoir. In fact, it's a collection of pieces, most of which have been published before, and indeed the longest piece appeared in the New Yorker in 2 parts back in, I think it was 2000 and 2001. So it's really not quite a memoir in that sense. There are only, I think, 2 or 3 chapters that are new. He told me that he wanted to publish this quite early on in the process, and told me to hurry up because he said, I'm not getting any younger. And that's fine. I mean, you know, I don't own his life. It's his life, and he can, I mean, if he wanted to write a full autobiography, that would be fine with me, and I'd be the first person to be queuing up to read it.
So Le Carré's books, as Joe just explained, are all about the human side, the ordinariness, the little human foibles, about human intelligence. But David Ignatius, your last spy novel is called The Quantum Spy, and it's about quantum computers, and it's a look into this high-tech world that we're living with all today in the age of social media and such. Very timely. And yet, even in this story, the role of human intelligence is central to understanding the plot. So can you talk a little bit about your book and your thinking about...
I think one challenge for spy novelists is that increasingly spying is about computers and the internet. I mean, covert action is, as we've seen with the Russians, the planting, amplifying of information through computer networks, the classic penetration stories, mole stories that John Le Carré wrote about these days involve electronic means of contact, compromise. And so the last 5 or 6 years, I've been trying to figure out as a novelist how you can be faithful. I like to write realistic spy novels. You can be faithful to the reality that it's about the intersection of computers, machines, and human beings, but also write something that doesn't feel like the extra credit problem that nobody wants to answer. And believe me, if you want, the writing about quantum computing was right on the borderline. It's really complicated. But it is, you know, it's sort of like the Manhattan Project. This is a machine that, if they can build it, will be able to decrypt anything that's ever been encrypted. That's the theory. And lay open every secret that anybody has. So it's of enormous value. It's sort of like the Manhattan Project. If you get it first, you have a huge advantage for a long time, for a while. And it's a race between us and China. The Chinese know how important it is and have said, we're going to capture this technology. So you want to write about it. How do you make it real? And I'll just say, the challenge in this book was inventing interesting Chinese intelligence officers. I think for me, in all of my books, you know, the things that I'm proud of are the Jordanian intelligence officer in Body of Lies, who dominates that book, the Pakistani chief head of ISI, who is interesting in Blood Money. And in this book, there's a character named Li Jian, who is, I think, an interesting, subtle person. It's hard to make American intelligence officers as subtle as you want. It just sort of goes against our grain, you know. So I have fun often with the foreign characters in these books.
Another way to deal with this issue is just to go to the past. You know, someone said to me, why do you write historical novels? And I said, well, I think of it as the recent past. And it's just pre-digital. I find it so much more interesting to meet somebody on a park bench and, you know, pass a newspaper than whenever anybody says to me, upload onto your server, I go, whatever that means, you know. And so I think it's very hard.
So Joe and David, the two novelists on the panel here, why have you never been tempted to do biography?
It takes too long and there's too much work.
Well, that's true. It takes longer to write a biography than a novel most of the time.
But I think there are many similarities between the forms. And look, we've been talking a lot about le Carré and the legacy, et cetera. And I think that the most profound legacy, aside from just adding good writing to the genre, has been that, to me, one of the great things that literature can do is to operate as an agent for moral inquiry. And I think that le Carré did that. What he was exploring was not simply the character of these people, but how they were going to deal with the morality of the actions that they were asked to participate in. It's the fundamental question should always be, how do we live and how should we live? I don't mean that writing should be prescriptive and no novel can actually answer that, but I think novels need to ask it, or otherwise they really are just James Bond, which are perfectly fun, and it's nothing against that, and God knows we'd all like his success and his money. But I think that, what le Carré did was open this whole field up to moral questions, and I think ultimately that makes for literature.
So, Adam, coming back to le Carré.
Yes.
I'm sorry, David?
No, I was going to, my answer would be just like Joe's. It's too hard to write nonfiction, too many footnotes. And I live in the world of fact twice a week. I get to write columns for the Washington Post. I want to say you have to read them, but then you don't have to read them either. So, I'm immersed in the world of fact, and to be able to escape it for this big canvas where you don't have to at the end say, this is precisely what you should think, this is precisely how it turned out. You can let all the ambiguities exist in the characters is such a rule. I'll write one nonfiction book, and that'll be my memoirs. But until then, I don't think so.
Okay. We look forward to the memoirs. So, Adam, finally, many of le Carré's novels the early ones are rather critical of the Cold War. That's a sort of message you get from them. And his later novels become increasingly, I think some critics have said, bitter and anti-American. Can you explain his politics?
I'm actually giving a talk on this subject on Wednesday at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Most people in general, this is a generalization, become more conservative as they get older, but David has gone in the opposite direction. He's become more radical and more angry. And I personally think to the detriment of his fiction. I think his best work was in the period when he was writing about George Smiley, when he deals with the ambiguities of the Cold War and the fact that neither side was completely right and neither side was completely wrong. Now, his novels appear to me to be much more black and white. They are goodies and baddies. In fact, they're more like the James Bond books. And I'm afraid all too often the baddies are American, although there's some pretty nasty Brits too. And I think there's a certain strain in David of, well, actually, I think it's a slightly old-fashioned, chippy attitude that some Englishmen of an older generation feel about America, resentment of America taking over from our role, our predominant role, which was not only exemplified in the events of the Second World War and the aftermath, but also was very much there in the minds of the intelligence officers, I think, at the time that David went into MI5 and MI6. I think that was very much in the culture, and also a feeling of bemusement by the fact that they'd been betrayed by Burgess, Maclean, Philby, etc. So yes, I agree. His politics have become more one-dimensional, and I think less interesting myself.
So I think we have time for 5 or 6 minutes of questions, if there are any from the audience. Aviva. There's one right behind you, I think.
named Mo Berg, American Spy, OSS, baseball player. I've already filmed David, and hopefully I will be filming Kai. What I'm realizing is Hollywood, which I'm not a part of, I think has contributed to the glamorization and the violence of what a spy's life is like. That it's more the more detailed work, the intelligence work, certainly someone like Mo Berg did, especially in terms of getting Italian scientists out. And they really did him injustice in the feature film that Hollywood just made with all these shootouts that had nothing to do with his career. So I'm just asking you, do you agree? Two questions that Hollywood, I think, has, especially the James Bond, I like the early James Bond, has contributed to taking away really the hard work a spy does. And second of all, I think we need the OSS back in terms of the cyber security. So I wonder what David thinks, because we don't need military parades. We don't need to go to the moon. We got to figure this out.
Well, we need the OSS back. We need, you know, the sorts of presidents who chartered the OSS. That'd be nice too. Aviva, I think I can't wait for your documentary on Mo Berg. Just because we're talking about John le Carré, you'd have to say that Hollywood has been faithful to the essence of what those books are about. They didn't screw them up. They didn't put a gun in Smiley's hand, or even really in Peter Gwillim's, although his job was, you know, the scalp hunter, the tough guy stuff. The movie that was made of one of my novels, Body of Lies, was faithful to the texture of it. They didn't. So I think Hollywood gets that the more realistic accounts of espionage are things that people want to see.
The movie they made out of my novel was just terrible, and actually, if they would have added some gunplay, it might have helped.
Good morning, and thank you for the discussion today. One of the motivating factors of spy novels, as I've seen it, is the clash of civilizations. How will the novel genre emerge over time with a change in class of civilizations from between the US and the Soviet Union to the US and China, to other venues of conflict, and how is that going to change how spy novels are both written and understood?
I think that's a really interesting question. And at the moment, we are in a state of hiatus. I think that obviously the interesting clash of the century we're now in is going to be Chinese. There's a great question of how much do fiction writers know about Chinese culture? How much do they know and can access Muslim culture or Middle Eastern culture? It's more difficult because it's, I think, a rarer knowledge on our part. Whereas Russia is definitely the devil we know and the devil we've been writing about for decades. And to be, I suppose, half frivolous, one of the things they've done is to give all of fiction writers a kind of breathing space because they're insisting on being center stage yet again. I mean, just when you thought that Russia was going to have to withdraw from this role, there they are. They just will not be shunted aside, at least in espionage. This is, you know, the great advantage they've always had. So I think for a while we're going to continue to have post-Cold War kinds of fiction being written. But ultimately, people are going to have to adjust and because what's really important is what is going to be China.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left.
Quick question. My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I've reported abroad for Associated Press and United Press International. And this is for Mr. Ignatius, whose columns indicate you have considerable access to the intelligence community. Now, we have a situation where the President of the United States is very antagonistic toward the intelligence community. And I'm wondering if you see any pushback from the intelligence community, a situation that could be quite dangerous.
You know, there is this argument on the right that the deep state the intelligence agencies is doing just that, is pushing back. I don't see that. You know, I have limited visibility. I always need to say most of the stuff about how much I know about the intelligence agencies is nonsense. I wish I did. But from what little I know, it's mostly what I think of as the Richard Helms philosophy: let's get on with it. Let's do our jobs. And I think both in terms of recruiting sources, in terms of liaison relationships, in terms of all the humdrum activities around the world, people just keep doing them. They have at the top of the pyramid a White House that, as we all know, is kind of unpredictable. But my sense is that the pushback you're thinking about, that I've thought about, every time I ask, I'm told not really happening. Okay. And not just by Americans, but by people overseas.
Thank you.
Okay, the last question here.
There's a recent novel written by Daniel De Silva called The Other Woman, in which he talks about Kim Philby quite a bit in the novel. In that, he talks about the tension between espionage and politics, and basically damns Britain because they allowed politics to get involved in the Philby situation. Can you address the tension between politics and espionage?
Sir.
Except to say that it always exists. In Philby's case, look, I think obviously what he's referring to is the fact that the establishment circled the wagons and decided to protect him. There is a theory that they were having conversations that in code said to him, for God's sakes, defect and get out of here so that we don't have to have a trial and expose everything to the public, which would be embarrassing, much in the same way that Anthony Blunt was protected, etc. I don't know that for a fact. I mean, I think it's one of those wonderful tropes that everybody uses in writing novels about that period. How can you separate them, though? I mean, the espionage is a function of the politics, and we are, you know, it may be true that it's the world's second oldest occupation, as everybody likes to say, but the kind of espionage that we're talking about, which is a vast government bureaucratic enterprise, is a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, in America, we didn't have a Central Intelligence Agency until '47. That's, you know, within our lifetimes, that's really short. And what we're now facing is, how do you marshal these vast bureaucracies? How do you control them? Are they going to be self-operating? Are they going to be responsive to government directives? Who knows? These are, you know, really interesting questions.
And one other word. I mean, the Cold War was about politics, wasn't it? I mean, it was a political argument between West and East, between communism and the free world. I mean, that, in essence, was what it was supposed to be about. So I don't see how you can separate the two.
Okay, one final anecdote I can't resist. In 1964, in the 1990s, I interviewed a CIA analyst who in 1964 wrote the World Intelligence Report. And very controversially, he predicted that the Soviet Union was facing economic collapse and internal ethnic tensions. And he predicted that sometime in the 1980s, it would collapse. He was allowed to put this into the report, but no one believed it, no one acted upon it, and no one wanted to believe that the major adversary was actually a weak paper tiger. And that, I think, says something about the world of intelligence, the ambiguity, and which Carré wrote about all throughout his novels. Anyway, thank you very much for coming.